I'm going to start. Okay. All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're just going to wait a couple of minutes, give folks a chance to get logged on and settled here, and then we will get started. Hey everyone, if you're just joining us, welcome. We are just going to wait another minute or two as folks log in here and get settled, and we'll get started in a little bit. Thanks for being here. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Alex Tarantino. I am the Preservation Delaware Chair for the Education Committee. So I'll kick us off here. I just want to say first, thank you to all of our 2023 conference sponsors. We're really grateful for your support. And of course, thank you in advance to our speakers today, Kerri in particular, who's going to be doing our next presentation. Just want to remind all of our attendees that you are muted in this webinar function. So to ask questions, you can use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and Kerri will answer questions after she's finished with her presentation. The chat box is also there to get in touch with me if you're having technical difficulties or something else that I can help you with. And then I also want to let you know that this workshop is going to be recorded, as are all of the other conference sessions. So we'll have them available after the conference on Preservation Delaware's website and YouTube channel. And then lastly, if you aren't already a member of PDI, I want to encourage you to consider joining us. Your support's really important. We love having folks from different perspectives to chime in and help. And it also helps keep events like this one free. So we'll post more info for you about our website details in the chat as well. So next up, I would like to introduce our speaker, Kerri Barile. She's the president of Dovetail Cultural Resource Group, which is based in Fredericksburg, Virginia. She has over 30 years of experience in historic preservation. Kerri received her BA in Historic Preservation from Mary Washington College, an MA in Anthropology and Museum Management from the University of South Carolina, and a Ph.D. in Archaeology and Architectural History from the University of Texas at Austin. Her research interests include urban archaeology, architectural construction methods, and studying social groups who are underrepresented in the historical record. Dr. Barile is also deeply committed to volunteering on preservation-related committees. She's been the technical editor of the annual bulletin of the Archaeological Society of Delaware for over a decade and on countless additional boards and commissions. So welcome, Kerri. Thanks so much again for being here.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you. I don't know how to my title today of my talk is Using Architectural Sleuthing to Understand Archaeological Sites. And as Alex was mentioning, I do kind of have a unique background. Yes, that's me. A few decades ago on the upper left-hand side, I am dually trained as both an archaeologist and an architectural historian. My specialty is how they come together. How can you read buildings through the soils and what's left in the earth? And so that's what this presentation really revolves around. Is that I want to show how you can really use archaeological methods and archaeological data to tell a lot about the architectural fabric of a place. Archaeologists find architectural remains all the time. They find a lot of brick, they find stone, they find nails, plaster, you name it, they find it quite a bit. And, a lot of archaeologists might weigh it, they might count it, but really they don't analyze it thoroughly. And it's for understandable. A lot of archaeologists are just trained in a different arena. They're trained as anthropologists in learning about people, which is of the utmost importance. But today I want to talk a little bit more about how if you really, really inspect those materials a little closer and filter it through a little bit of architectural history knowledge, you can really enhance your information about a site. Because I know a lot of folks who are on this webinar might not be archaeologists, I thought I'd throw in literally 3 slides to kind of make you archaeological experts in just a short period of time. Of course, I can answer any questions at the end more about archaeology in general, but just to clarify what archaeology is, it is the recovery, analysis, and interpretation of material culture of past human lifeways. In other words, the artifacts they leave behind, the features, in other words, a foundation or a post hole or something like that. And an eco-fact is where you might have a natural product that has been modified by humans. Say if you have a corn cob that's been burned, that would be a natural material, but that's been modified. You dig in the earth to find these materials, and they can tell you more about how people lived in the past. Now, here's the most important slide. What is archaeology not? And you get this a lot. We don't dig dinosaurs. We don't look like kind of creepy 1940s bank robbers with a metal detector. And we are not Indiana Jones, although I do wish that my colleague sometimes looks like him. But archaeology really is a careful, sound science to understand lifeways of the past. The archaeology research is really driven by several things. The first is if you have a larger research question. So Dovetail right now is working very closely with the state at John Dickinson Plantation when they have beautiful, amazing research questions, and they're doing a careful approach to archaeological studies to really understand all residents of the past. You also could have a site where there's a private owner or an interest group. We've done work on certain places where, like Fort DuPont and Fort Delaware, where someone might have specific interest in one place. And then sometimes you might have what you would call a field school. I'm sure most of you on this call have heard about a field school where you go to train future archaeologists at a particular site. But what's really interesting that most people don't think about is that archaeology is primarily driven by the legislation that's out there. Federal, state, and local laws that actually require archaeology to be done before certain projects. 80% of the archaeology they believe in the United States is related to one of these laws. Primarily here, we look at the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966, which I know most of you have heard of. There's also the Archaeological Resources Protection Act of 1979. And there are many states and local regulations. I know that Lewis, Delaware, for example, is trying to look at creating an archaeological ordinance themselves. So just the general note here is that when we do archaeology, the vast majority of the time is that it's done because of one of these laws. A lot of localities don't have these laws. So if you are, say, putting in a housing development that does not require an ordinance, archaeology might not be needed. But luckily, a lot of times it is. I do see that we have one comment in the chat, so we'll go ahead and look at that a little later once we get just a little bit further into the program. Today, I want to talk about 3 sites that we identified located along the US 301 project. And this is sponsored by the Delaware Department of Transportation and the Federal Highway Administration. Most of you are aware of the 301 mega project going just west of the town of Middletown. And that spurred an incredible amount of archaeology. It involved almost a dozen CRM firms coming together to really ensure that as much research is done as possible. So the sites we're going to talk about today are Houston-LeCompte, Armstrong-Rogers, and the Burnham House. The Burnham House was along a spur of 301 that was not constructed but was considered for a while. So first, let's talk about the Houston-LeCompte site. This is located just south of Boyd's Corner Road. And that's my dog in the background. I apologize to everyone. This site, I guess, is located just south of the Boyd's Corner Road, and it was actually first originally established in 1732, so it did have quite a long antiquity to it. I'm going to shut my door so my dog stops barking at everybody. Sorry about that. That's what you get when you work from home. Um, the first time we definitely know that there was a building on the site was in the 1770s and was occupied by Jacob and Mary Houston and their family. And they lived there the Houstons lived there for decades. Mary Houston actually took over the farm after her husband died in the 1790s, and she ran it as a single female head of household for 20 years, which is a little bit unusual at this time period. This map does show Mary's orphan court map of 1829, which does show the building that was located there on the site. And when Mary died, her son James took over the property. And James had the house for a number of decades before he died in the 1850s. This is James's orphan court, showing his estate at the time. The house was then sold throughout the decades and eventually ended up in the hands of a gentleman named James LeCompte. What's interesting about James LeCompte is that he never lived here. He actually ran the property as a rental property, and it was run as a rental property from the 1850s all the way up to the 1930s. So it definitely hosted a number of families who lived there and called this property home. Eventually, it did actually go back to the Houston family. In 1885, it went back to Harriet Houston, who is a distant relation to the original Houston family, but yet she also ran it as a tenant farm. The house was gone by the mid-1930s, and the land became all agricultural fields. When Route 301 was planned through this area, the area did go through numerous phases of archaeology. It started with the Phase 1 archaeological survey. It then was subject to Phase 2 archaeological testing. And then finally, it was the subject of Phase 3 archaeological data recovery. Data recovery is where you open up very large areas to expose as much of the area as you possibly can. Now, here we were lucky. We had an agricultural field, and so we were able to bring out a backhoe with a flat blade who scraped the earth, and it allows us to really look at the features that were left by past buildings and past human occupations. We've actually found over 300 features here, and where you see the blue markings on this map, those are all the places that we found features related to this about 250 years of occupation at this site. Every feature, again, it's a different soil color, different soil stain, was mapped, and we were then able to really get into them and try to analyze and figure out how this site was used in the past. We found the foundations of the original Houston house from the 1770s. We found that it had a kitchen and a root cellar adjacent to it. So all the earth that was removed was screened. We were able to look for the artifacts as well as the features to tell us about how people use this site. I don't want to get too much in the artifacts because this talk is really about the architecture. But I'm going to say that I've been doing archaeology now for over 30 years, and this site had the coolest collection of personal items that I've ever seen. It was breathtaking. The number of buckles and beads and jewelry and cufflinks was just mind-boggling. It really helps us understand the aesthetics and the personal lives of the people who lived here. But we're really going to talk more about architecture with this site. And the architectural that remains were here were fantastic. We found brick, stone, nails, plaster, mortar, you name it, what came out of this site. And we were able to really do a very careful analysis to try to understand how the site was used in the past. And also, what do these buildings look like? That was a big thing for us. So the first thing we did was we took the images that are on the orphans court records, and again, knowing these are just sketches, these aren't exact, but they gave us a little bit of an idea, and then you combined it with the archaeology, and we're like, okay, we know about basic size, about what these buildings look like. So we then went out and did some homework. So we looked at the buildings that were nearby, and that dated about the same time period. So anything you see there that is in green dates approximately to the same time period as the original Houston house. James LeCompte, when he got the property in 1865, tore down the Houston house and built a second house on top of it. And so we also looked at houses that dated to that time frame. Again, so that's everything in yellow. The idea was, let's look at these to see if we note any patterns in the standing buildings that can help us inform the archaeological record. So here's a couple comparables to the Houston period house, and I try to note the original section of all these houses, and what you can see is most of them were about 2 to 3 bays wide, 2 stories tall. Most of them at the time had an interior or exterior end chimney. So they had a lot of commonalities in what we were seeing in the side gable roof and a lot of the different elements. And this gave us a really good understanding of what the architectural fabric probably looked like when they originally built this Houston house in the 1770s. We also found a number of comparables for the LeCompte house. This is the second house on site that was built in 1865. And as you see by this time, as we all know from architectural history, things became a little more symmetrical. You still had 2 stories. You still had, 3 to 5 bays wide. Inside gable, we started seeing some cross gabling going on, double chimneys. Also, in later time periods, you had the interior chimneys for the uses with stoves. So what did that mean for us interpreting this area as an archaeological site? So what I'm going to do now is kind of walk through the different time periods of occupation on the site and kind of show you how we interpret the archaeological features into the design of the architectural buildings that were once there. This helps us really understand how the landscape was used, as well as what the buildings actually looked like and how they changed over time. And more importantly, what do those changes say about how people lived and then how people's lives were modified based on improvements in technology or maybe as families grew? So here are the features that date to the original time period of the house, about 1770 when the Houstons first got there. And we entered this time period in 1816. This is when Mary Houston, the original Houston family, when she died. So these are the features that date to her time period. And the first thing we see, of course, is the main house. So what we did is we took all of the architectural remains that we found during the archaeological dig, filtered them through the comparables that we found, and we're as well as the archival research, and we were able to determine about what the house looked like. It was log. It had 2 stories, just 2 bay side gable roof with probably an interior and chimney. So that's kind of what we got from there. We also then looked and realized that next door there was a kitchen. Now, again, we're talking the late 18th century into the early 19th century. At the time, this was a standalone kitchen. There was no connection between it and the house. And again, we see this pretty often in a lot of the architectural remains in buildings that are still extant today. But this allowed us to really figure out what this building looked like. This properties also had 3 notable outbuildings at the time. We found probably a corn crib closest to the road. That's based on the foundation, the pillows that we kind of uncovered the evidence of those. In the southwest corner, there was an agricultural building there. And then the southeast corner was very interesting. We're pretty sure we had an agricultural barn with a series of stalls at the end, which are noted by a series of post holes. And then a second well was located there as well for use for animals. So it really helped us understand the architectural fabric. But the archaeology and the current conditions also really helped us understand more about why the buildings were placed the way they were. First thing you'll notice is they're pretty spread apart, and that's pretty typical of plantations and properties at this time. They had a much wider distribution of buildings around a domestic complex. The other thing that was a little interesting at this site, this is a photograph of what it looked like after a rain. That is the outbuilding right below it called Outbuilding 5, and it reflooded all the time. So we're pretty sure that that's why they kind of put maybe a little more ephemeral outbuilding down there. It's down a slope, and when I say down a slope, I mean by like 2 feet. But that is probably explains a little bit about use, how it was put together, and then how it was used in the long term. The next time period we're going to talk about is the second period. So Mary had just passed away, and the property is passed on to her son James. And so this time period is 1816 to 1865. You remember 1865 is the year that James LeCompte got the property, and he did some massive modifications. So this is the time period in between. Through archaeology and careful architectural analysis, we were able to determine what changes had been made on the property. The first is a pretty decent change to the house itself. While the main massing didn't change, we found that what was a separate kitchen had been then by a point connected by a hyphen. And this is documented pretty thoroughly in the archaeological record based on the type of nails we found, as well as some of the information we have in the archival records. For example, we think by that point, the windows had been changed out to be double hung sash. That we know that from the window glazes we found. The house was probably resided at that point using some sort of weatherboard. And we do know a porch was appended over the front. Again, this is from the archaeological remains that we found at the site of the time. So it really helped us understand the evolution. And what's notable about this is this occurred right about the same time that James got married. James got married, had several children. The other difference here is that James actually owned up to 4 at any time enslaved individuals. So the larger home might have also been accommodating all the bigger population that was living on this property. The 3 outbuildings had not changed at that point. He kind of kept them the way his parents had. Didn't find much changes in that realm. And then here is the next time period. So this is 1865 to about 1900. As I mentioned, what was interesting here is that James LeCompte tore down the original house. He also then built a new house on the site. But what you'll probably see here is the change in the landscape. So what we have is actually the outbuildings kind of got tighter. So when the property got smaller, fields became more important. You wanted to maximize your amount of crops. And so we see all the outbuildings kind of slowly coming in together to be clustered into one spot. So this is our analysis of what we think that the Houston tenant house looked like. Again, it would have a lot of similarities to our comparables. And this directly relates to the archaeological record and reflects what we saw out there. Oops, let's see if I can go backward. Trouble with the mouse. So this is kind of interesting. With what I'm showing in yellow, that was the foundation of the original Houston house where it was located. And then you can see kind of how the overlap of the tenant house and the cellar. Now, what's interesting is that the northeast corner of the tenant house, as you notice, is within the cellar of the Houston house. Structurally, this was a problem. And we figured all this out because there were no less than 10 post holes at that corner to support that corner of the house because they all kept failing because they were located in fill within the cellar. We also found a well that had been constructed at this time as a new well. It was a brick-lined well, and it looks like what they did was they robbed the brick from the original Houston house because it's a handmade, very friable brick, and they used that to craft the shaft of the well. That's pretty different than the earlier well, which is a boxed well. So it definitely had a different form, but they reused old architectural materials. We also found that they had a new outbuilding at this time. It was moved a little closer to the house. It was probably a general agricultural barn or a shed, and we found this out by the numerous post holes as well as trenches that we found related to this building. And now we're going to the fourth time period, which is 1900 and 1930s, and this is the last tenant period of the house. And as you see, the property still remained, again, very nucleated. All the outbuildings were pulled in very, very tight. Again, because if you're tenant farming, you're renting this land, you need to pay for it, and you need to maximize your crops to the greatest degree possible. The change we saw to the house was that they actually put a kitchen on the side of it. It was attached kitchen. Again, think about what time period we're talking about. We're starting to finally get indoor plumbing and electricity. So the house had been enlarged by that time period. Excuse me. And then the other outbuildings actually remained the same. That's the outbuilding that was, we believe, turned into a garage and the well. What was really interesting to us, and again, this refers back to how we use architectural materials, is that when we excavated that well, and again, this well was put in 1865, when we started excavating it, we found an incredible number of architectural materials. We found stone, brick, wood, we found pressed tin, you name it. And what we were able to determine is exactly not only what the houses were made of, because when they tore it down in the 1930s, they literally pushed it all in the well and we found it. We even found plaster that showed us exactly what colors were used in the house. And we found so much information about exactly what these buildings look like based on the archaeological remains that they pushed into the well. So through all that, we were able to really do some incredible overlays. And these are artistic renderings that were created by David Rickman, and they show the different 4 time periods of the house. And I'm going to flip through my slides, and you can watch how the property changed over time. 1770, the Houstons moved in. They have a pretty spread out property. They have a well, and they have the agricultural outbuilding. Here we are now in the next time period, 1816 to 1865. James Houston owns the property. We can see it's been a bit refined. As we talked about, the kitchen became attached. We had weatherboard put on the main building, and everything's kind of a little bit more polished. By the time we moved to 1865, this is James LeCompte's rental property. You can definitely tell the agricultural fields are coming closer. And you can see that the house was reoriented toward the road and with a new road alignment. And then in the 20th century, again, we can see that the outbuildings have become fewer and fewer as people did not need to rely so much on self-sufficiency. They had the automobile and different technology to get to other locales. So archaeology really was able to tell us a lot, not just about the material, not just about the ceramics or the glass, but look what we could tell about the place, the landscape, the buildings, just based on a really careful analysis of the archaeological remains. All right, we're now going to talk about the Armstrong Rogers site, which is just north of Middletown. And again, you can kind of see the blue line, and that's where the road actually ended up coming through it. So this property is not quite as old. While we do know that the property was sold to Alexander Armstrong in 1739, it was, again, probably the late 18th century before someone actually lived on the site. And it was his son Cornelius who was the first person to live here. The first description we get of this site is in 1797, and then they talk about having a log house and a barn is really the big things that we mentioned on the landscape. By 1849, the property had been sold to the James Rogers, and he lived there with his family for several decades. And in 1849, just after this map was prepared, it was actually sold to the Crawford family, and they actually called it Willow Bridge Farm. They had a name for the property. Here's William Crawford's estate map, and you can see the main house there where it's drawn. And by this point, the railroad had come through, and it kind of created this wedge of land there right above the creek. And this is just an 1893 map, again showing the house still remains. We know that the house was extant until probably the 1960s. In the 1960s, the house was torn down and a modern house was built on it. So this is interesting. The aerial image that you see on the left here kind of shows the areas we did archaeology on. You can see the 1960s house. The 1960s house was built almost exactly on top of the historic house. But the areas that are interested for archaeologists are an area that was out front by the road, dashed yellow, and then even more so, just below it, which was a work yard. And so whereas we talked a lot about the original house for the Houstons and the LeComptes, here we're going to talk more about the work yard and the outbuildings, because this is what really shined from an archaeological perspective. Again, you can see how many features we found when we started digging. Same thing, we went with the backhoe and we stripped and we looked for features and artifacts. We did find a few up by the house, but again, mostly it was down in that southern area where all the outbuildings existed. Again, I don't want to go too much in the artifacts, but we did find about 12,000 artifacts. Again, we found shoes. What you see down on the bottom are actually forks and nails and ceramics and so many wonderful materials that really represent the people, but also how this area was used. We didn't find the same teapots and smoking apparatus and things we found at the house site, because here we're dealing with a series of outbuildings, and the artifacts we found really were related to more the utilitarian side of the household. But let's talk about the architecture. That's why we're here today. So this is kind of an overview of the area as it was stripped. And again, this has been the south yard, south of the main house itself. And here are some of the outbuildings that we found. And we're going to be talking about these individually. We found a smokehouse with an adjacent well. We also found a corn crib, and we found a dairy, and the dairy had an adjacent well to that as well. It was actually a really, really neat, tight cluster of outbuildings. So this is the smokehouse and the well. This was a box well that we found, so it would have had a wood cribbing, and the photographs you see on top show the circular well on the right, and some of the wood cribbing pieces that we found in the center. And it was right next to the smokehouse, and we found, of course, as you can imagine, an incredible amount of animal bone that came out of it. But again, we found a lot of information archaeologically to tell us a little bit more about what the building looked like. So again, we looked at our comparables. Here are some nearby smokehouses that have been documented over time. You can see some commonalities. They weren't very large. Some of them, while they might have a continual foundation, and most of them were more what you see in the upper left corner, where they actually sat on piers, which is what this one did. And so it allowed us to really kind of come together and figure out how these buildings looked over time. Now, this feature is, again, one of the most interesting features that we've ever found as Dovetail, and as I have as an archaeologist. It was really, really intricate, and it was so neat from a technological standpoint to see how these features came together to work. And this was the dairy and the associated well. And this is what it looked like after we stripped the area and before we started digging. And this is what it looked like when we're done excavating. You can see the stone foundation, and you can see kind of stone around the well, which is actually to the north, but it kind of shows you, I don't know, how complex they were. And this is just a view looking from the other direction. And I point this out because you can see it had a brick laid floor, and it actually had a brick drain. It was very, very complex. What was very interesting about this is that the well, and you can see that in the background, the well collected water. Water was pumped up from the well. I'll show you the photograph of that in a minute. It was channeled through the dairy and then out from a drain from the side. Here is a close-up of the drain, and you can see we'd also dug a unit to see where that water went, and you can see that the drain actually continued south into the creek below. And this was incredible. So one of the jokes about archaeology you always see is you always find the coolest thing on the last day. This was found within the last hour, literally the last hour of a 6-7 week dig that we found. This is a pump well. So that is an 8-foot long hexagonal piece of hickory, weighed over 800 pounds, that was used to actually pump the water up from the bottom up. And you can see some of the other well pieces. It pumped it up and then it went into the dairy. It was beautiful. The craftsmanship was just incredible. So we also, again, looked at not just comparables as far as what dairies look like, but also archaeological sites. And it was really neat. So we found ours. That's the bottom picture. The upper left is another dairy that was found by Louis Berger in 1999, very close by, the same county. And you can see it's so similar. You had the well, you had the stone-lined foundation of the dairy, and then you had the drain coming off of it, just like we found. Almost the same time period, but it really starts us understanding how complex some of the architecture was at this time and how they really thought through the technology to make sure that the way you put a building together, it really helped with its functionality. And then when you didn't need it, they truncated it. And now from an archaeological perspective, we're finding it all. And again, we also looked at dairies that were kind of nearby or in the region to help us understand a little bit more about what it probably looked like. So here you can see kind of a pyramidal roof and such. The last site we're going to talk about is the Burnham House. As I mentioned, this was along the spur. That's why it's here in yellow rather than along the main line of Route 301. But this one had just kind of a little bit of a different history as well. This one actually was occupied pretty early. This is part of Benjamin Knoxon's, they call it Knoxon's Adventure, originally founded in 1734. This map dates to 1771. We know that it was actually occupied by 1768. So again, we're talking about a similar time period of actual documented occupation. We know at the time when they first moved in, this is described as, you see this quote below, a log house. We've seen now several log houses, a smokehouse, barns, a very typical plantation of the time. The property was then inhabited by the Burnham family. Thomas Burnham actually married the daughter of the Knoxons, so keep it in the family. Joanna Burnham, who was Thomas's wife, she again was this very strong, amazing female presence who then, once her husband Thomas died, she ran the property for 30 years, and she just kept it going. The interesting thing about this property is that it was along, and some people please may have heard this. This is the Reedy Island Cart Roads, the Reedy Island Road. This is another feature that's been found archaeologically in numerous places, and a lot of research was done on this road as part of the 301 project to understand not just road construction, understand how people moved about to place and transportation at the time. So this is a neat map from 1837 that not only shows the road, but you can kind of see the Burnham House, the original Burnham House that's been drawn on there. This is an 1868 map, again, that shows Knoxon's adventure, and then S. Burnham, because again, the house stayed in the Burnham house by this time period. In 1873, the descendants of the original Burnhams actually still own the house. They tore down the original log house that we saw from previous quotes, and they built a new two-story frame dwelling on the property. These photographs were taken of that quote unquote new 1873 two-story frame building. The photographs on top were taken in 1988, and thank goodness they were taken, because in the 1990s, the house caught on fire. It did burn to the ground. So what we found archaeologically when we did the work in 2011 is below. And you can see all we had left was the chimney of an attached kitchen and the foundation of the basement. But the foundation of the basement, if you look at it from an architectural perspective, told us an incredible, incredible amount about how this property was put together. It originally had a stone foundation, which could have reused some of the stones probably from the original house in the 18th century. And then it had a brick transition to the frame structural system. Now, this is what was wild about this house, and it took a long time to really figure out what happened here. And so all of you guys who are architectural nerds like me and you love bricks, you're going to realize why this is kind of an anomaly. This house was built in 1873. The foundation was stone. What we then found was stone, machine-made brick, with some handmade brick on top of that, and then, of course, a timber frame structural system. It took us a lot of analysis and archaeology to try to figure out what happened here. And so we did a lot of units around the main house to figure out how it was put together in order to figure out how the people lived. We found the burn layer, which a very, very thick burn layer from the 1990s, but that sealed in all of the architectural materials that really allowed us to help figure out what happened here and how you have this kind of unusual circumstance of why things came together. And it turns out what we think happened, and this is kind of a photograph of what we saw. So you have the stone foundation, you have this massive, massive repointing episode, and then the machine-made brick. The key here was the chimney of the adjacent kitchen. When you got close together, when you actually touched those bricks, the kitchen brick, they almost fell apart in your hands. They were that friable. And that had only been exposed at that point for about 10 years. So think about what happened between the time the house burned in the 1990s, excuse me, at that point. So, but that brick had become that weak in such a short period of time. We think what happened is that when they made the bricks for the original Burnham house in 1873, they reused some older bricks from clay, and they were just not baked very well. And so they basically crumbled. And that then required them to actually put in this new machine-made transition by knocking it out, the old foundation section by section, because every about 3 or 4 feet we had a different brick bond, and then putting in this new machine-made brick transition. It was really very interesting, but it showed something that we never would have expected to find about the fortitude and the industrial nature of these folks in the early 20th century to repair this house and keep this house standing. And it must have not have been an easy task. Now, around the house, we found quite a number of outbuildings that helped support the 1873 property, a lot of barns, walls, and other structures that were out there. We also did some archaeology, not just in the cluster around the Burnham house, but also to the north and the south. And this is where architecture gets a little interesting. To the north of it, if you see all those little dots to the north, those are all 18th century artifacts. So we know there obviously is an 18th century component here. We knew that there was the original house that dates the end of the 18th century. We also know that the Reedy Island Cart Road came through here. So we figured there probably was some presence, but is there any link? Is there any link to really confirm that there was occupation along the radii and cart road? Is there any evidence to confirm that this property was indeed where that earlier house was? We do think this cluster had something to do with it, but again, the cluster wasn't anywhere near where the buildings were. So what's going on here? So again, there's an image of the radii and cart road. This is the drawing in 1771, and this is a map in 1844. So you can see that, if you can see, there's a kind of like the swooping down, that's the same road. So we knew it was here, and we knew something had been going on, and we kept trying to find that evidence. What is that link? There's got to be a link here between the 18th century and then what we're seeing today. Our evidence amazingly came from one of the outbuildings that was right in the middle of the property. As you all see, this is a garage, and it was a 20th century garage. And we're going, okay, so that's just the way we thought it was. We took some photographs, and then we really started taking a very careful look at all the outbuildings, but especially this one, because there was something different. We did archaeology around it, as you see, and they really climbed inside of it to try to understand more about this building in particular and try to find that link to the 18th century occupation, and then specifically the use of the Reedy Island Cart Road. So when you actually get inside that building, you start seeing this. You start seeing notched frame, pegs. You start seeing evidence of different circular, very early circular sawn lumber from a later time frame. It was incredible. So what we realized was that this frame had been reused 3 times. It was originally built and used as part of the original occupation in the 18th century. It was probably originally located closer to the north by the Radii and Cart Road. Archaeologically, we know it was then moved in the mid-19th century to be used by the Burnhams. They reframed part of it, as you can see from the very early circular sawn lumber, and then it was converted again in the 20th century to be a garage. So this one building, if you really, really analyze it from an archaeological perspective, an architectural perspective, a landscape perspective, you can see this one building really encapsulates all of the occupation of the site and helped answer a lot of questions about how this area was converted and used historically. And then this is a neat kind of overlay. You can then see exactly where our sites fall within the Reedy Island Cart Road. And now we've confirmed that there was a spur that came off of it, which also helped really establish the occupation. So what I'm trying to do here is go through a few sites and kind of walk through from an archaeological perspective, how we originally found them. From an architectural perspective, how the materials came together with the archival research to figure out what the buildings look like, as well as how the landscapes were used, and how you really can take a multi-discipline approach to really understanding Delaware's past. So with that, I see that there are some chats and some questions, and I'm happy to answer those. Alex, did you want me to kind of go into those, or would you like to moderate for us?
Whatever you are comfortable with. Yeah, if you want to go through, I'm totally fine with that. You let me know.
Sure. I'm going to actually stop sharing my screen if that's okay with everybody, so I can see some names and faces. I can figure out how to do this. Let's see. No, that's the stop sharing. The big button that says stop sharing. I can figure that one out on my own. All right. I know. It's Thursday, folks. Okay, so in the chat we have a couple of things. Those are from Alex, and she had kind of said to members submit your questions. And we have a question that says, "When the well of the Houston Lacombe site had recovery of building materials, was the well dry?" Yes, there was no water in the well. We did it 2 phases. The first thing we did was to use archaeology to just take a quarter of the well out. That's how we got the architectural materials. And then we actually used a backhoe to take half of it out, which is the images you saw, so that we could then really look at its profile, its side-on view, to understand exactly how the well was put together and the materials that was made of. We have some questions and answers, and I'm just going to go ahead and read those to folks. And the first says, "This is fascinating." Why, thank you. When an archaeological dig is completed, where do these artifacts end up? Do they ever end up in local museums? And are they available to other researchers anywhere? And that's an excellent question. Legally, the artifacts from most states belong to the property owner. That is unless there is an agreement that is put in place prior to the excavation that says they should go to the state repository, or if there's another agreement that's put in place at the time. The artifacts actually from the Houston LeCompte site are on display at the Smyrna rest area now, a good chunk of those. And some of them from, I think it's the from Rogers maybe, are on display at the 95 rest stop. All the rest of the collection actually is at the State Historic Preservation Office, and they're all cataloged there. There's full catalogs in all the boxes. We also preserved a lot of the wood, and this is huge. Make sure I say this. This is really huge kudos to DelDOT and FHWA. They put the money forth to make sure the well wood, that 8-foot long piece of hickory, has actually been preserved. And that is, again, a tutor at the Archaeological Repository in Dover. So those have been preserved for the future, and a good chunk of them actually are on display. And if anybody's interested, yes, you can arrange to probably go look through the boxes and take a look at those artifacts as well. Were there any different time periods of occupation built in the same footprint, and how you did tell them apart? Great question. And the answer is yes. We did find, for example, when certain buildings were put on top of each other, we're pretty sure, for example, the Burnham House was the new building was put on top of part of the old building. And we can tell them by, again, that's where you take archaeology and architecture and put them together. Nails change over time. So you can easily tell if they started using a different kind of nail that wasn't invented when the house was originally built, something different had to have happened. We know the same thing for mortars. You can tell that sometimes they started with a mud mortar, and then they transitioned to maybe Portland cement, which is a later time period. The same thing with plaster. So just like a ceramic or glass or anything, the architectural materials actually evolve over time, and they have certain periods they're used more than others. And so we can definitely look at that chronology combined with the archival research and to tell us exactly what the periods were used and when and how things were reused over time. And the next question is, if older architectural materials are reused to rebuild something, is it difficult to date a site? And the answer is no, again, because of the way things are put together. The law of superposition says that anything that's deeper is older. And so you can start really to use that as well, again, as the evolution of materials to understand how things kind of came together. I'm not going to tell you it's easy. There's sometimes I sit in front of a brick wall, and you can ask my staff, I've sat in front of some brick walls for literally hours just staring at them, just trying to figure out what happened. But if you really just stop and look at it and think about technology and think about common sense sometimes, and how these things came together, it can really tell you so much about a site without just saying, hey, it's a brick. Well, let's talk more about a brick. There's a site in Virginia, for example, where we were able to not only date it, but figure out exactly which features were built at the same time, because one of the batches of bricks had been left out in the rain, literally, and it had all these little rain pock marks on it. And so by comparing the bricks from one side to the other and looking at the surfaces, we were able to say, okay, these are from the same batch. So these features are probably built at the same time. Regarding the range of personal items at the first site, is there a reason for the wide range and number of artifacts? Is it just that more happen to survive versus other sites may have been disturbed? Or does it say something about the tenant's socioeconomic status? And that's a great question. The answer is both. So the Houston site, when James LeCompte came in, he again tore everything down and shoved it in the cellar of the Houston house. And that includes, we're pretty sure that there was actually wardrobes and things that had clothes in them, because we found a lot of things that literally stacked on top of each other, like artifacts in the earth. And you're like, why is there such a big stack of cufflinks in this cluster? And we think that that's why. So that's part of it. It's just the way the site came together. But the other does say something. We did notice that we had two distinct clusters of when the personal artifacts came from. The first is the original Houston occupation from the 1770s through about 18 teens. There's a dense cluster. We then found another dense cluster actually from the 20th century. And if you think about what's happening, is you start getting more more mass production. And so when you start getting 1880s, 1890s, that's why if you saw some of those materials, they're more Art Deco in design, definitely 20th century. It was just much easier to obtain personal items like that. But there is a dearth between about 1820s, 30s through about the 1880s. And that's a combination of who lived there, their socioeconomic status, and the availability of this kind of objects. The next question: we are in Lewis. We were told by an archaeologist that once a parcel was disturbed in the past, say by a building from the 40s or 50s, that the likelihood of finding any colonial evidence after that would be rare. Is that accurate? And the answer is it depends. What I can definitely say is an urban environment, and I can say this because this is an area I do have some expertise in, is that human nature says you take down and remove what you have to, but you just leave in place what you don't need to deal with. I've dealt on some urban properties where I've literally found 4 foundations on top of each other because the ones before it just took down what they needed to and then built on top of it. Took down what you need to, you build on top of it. It's just what you do. Um, so it just depends on what kind of destruction you're talking about. Did they come in with a backhoe in the 40s or 50s, which is totally possible, and removed it all and then rebuilt? Maybe. So maybe there isn't any. However, in an urban lot, you also could have this circumstance where they just took down what was there and built right on top of it. So unfortunately, without actually looking at the earth, it's kind of impossible to know at the outset what happened there. But I will say, is it there's the potential? Absolutely. You just need to dig a little bit to find out.
That makes sense. That's awesome. I think maybe like on the same thinking about Lewis. Kerri, did you mention that it was it Lewis who's trying to come up with like a local archaeological? Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
I can, and let me make sure to say that I'm not the expert here, but I can tell you this. I am sort of a member of the Archaeological Society of Delaware board, so they can answer much better than I can. But a draft ordinance was passed around just for review. And I got involved because I spend about half my time in Delaware and half in Virginia. In Virginia, I live in Fredericksburg. Fredericksburg passed an archaeological ordinance in 2001. It took 15 years to pass it, but we did it. And so when that Lewis ordinance came around, I did want to review it because I said, okay, I do have some experience because we now, not only did I wasn't on the team to develop it, but I've also been the one to help now put it in action for the past 2 years. And so I felt like I've seen some pitfalls, but I've seen some things work really well.
Yeah.
So I did review it. And so what I know of right now, and again, there are others who know more, is that it has been reviewed. It is still under consideration. They're tweaking now the language to make sure that there aren't any of those holes, that some unforeseen circumstances might be flashed out a little bit. But yeah, from what I understand, it is the goal of the community to pass an archaeological ordinance. It's not like many small communities, and I say small, small, but they're not like DC, right? So the goal is, how do you find a way to request archaeology, sometimes require archaeology, but without putting the onus, the financial onus, on someone who just wants to put an addition on their home, right? Or may not have a lot of money. But you want to find that balance between getting the information and then just being a responsible part of your community. And I think that's what they're understandably struggling with right now, because that's what they should be struggling. These are really important questions. And most people who pass these ordinances go through the same thing. So right now, from what I understand, it has been out in front of the council quite a bit, and they're now refining their language.
Awesome. Well, I mean, that's great to hear because that's like I, in my day job, work sort of in the regulatory compliance arena. And yeah, right. It's like you mentioned, it's the federal laws most of the time that, kind of dictate these processes. But it's cool to see that, maybe there is some movement towards developing local ordinances that, will sort of help to at least, if not protect, at least, in advance of something, get some information and document things. So that's awesome. I guess like follow-up question for that, in terms of and maybe Fredericksburg would give a good example, but so with like not wanting to put the onus on the property owner, has Fredericksburg developed like a way around that? Are they engaging like a local university, or do folks do pro bono work? Like how does that work?
So what they've done here is it's a combination of all of the above. They have on-call archaeologists who we kind of negotiated rates and to go in to do these kind of things. So anytime anybody wants to develop a property, we do the downtown work. So they'll call me, and I go look in maps, and I'm honest and say, "There's no potential here," or "There might be something here. Let's do the next phase of work." And so it's a combination of, if you have to do a major site plan. So in other words, someone's spending a lot of money to develop, there's usually more archaeology that's required, and the onus is put on the property owner. However, if you're putting on an addition, for example, or something small, it's a private homeowner, the city has set aside funds to pay for archaeological services to get that research accomplished. For example, we did that here in Fredericksburg about 2 months ago. I got the call and they said, well, they're just putting in an addition, but it's in this really key part of town. And I looked up some maps and I said, okay, there's a potential for a quarter for enslaved people there. So we went out and as part of the construction process, we went out right before them. You know, they had to do some earth removing anyway. We combined with them. We worked in teamwork. So we ended up in the long run finding the quarter. And luckily, it's just outside of the addition. So it's going to be preserved, which is really pretty cool. But it's a really wonderful way for us to get some great data, for the homeowner not to have to spend any money, the city not to spend a ton. So it just, because we timed it with them and we understood that we didn't want to put off their addition because they were going through enough. But they were gracious enough to allow us to time our study with theirs, and the city was gracious enough to pay for it. And then Dovetail, of course, gave what we could as well because it's a really important site. So it's been a big partnership, and it really just depends on a lot.
Yeah. Oh no, that's awesome. It's really interesting. And yeah, those kind of partnerships I feel like are paramount in situations like this where you really need to get everybody kind of on board and find a solution, I guess, that that works in some ways for everybody.
Absolutely.
I see. Oh, okay. So it looks like we've got another comment. We have more of a comment. Thanking you for your work in Lewis and for the information here. That this person also visits historical sites in Fredericksburg and appreciates the new regulations there too. So that's awesome.
Yeah, no, it's a great model. And other communities have looked to it. They did a lot of homework. I said it took 15 years for that one to pass it because they wanted it to be fair. And it is. I think that not just I'm biased, but I do think it took a lot, but they developed a very fair and conscientious ordinance to assure that everyone kind of gets something out of it.
That makes sense. All right, let me see. So got a couple more minutes. Maybe I'll say if anybody has a last minute question that they can think of, please put it in the Q&A. In the meantime, I maybe have, I don't know if it's so much of a question like as it is maybe a comment on just something neat, but thinking about archaeology and architecture and kind of historical archaeology. um, I know you showed there is some documentary evidence, right? Like there were some maps, but there are still like a lot of gaps in knowledge that, when you actually get down there and you're digging, you're able to kind of inform some of those questions. But I guess what struck me and strikes me as interesting is and this is where my vernacular architecture background comes in, and thinking about buildings as artifacts, right, and reading buildings. But I thought it was really interesting how you all are also using examples of extant architectural examples to to inform that like analysis and say, well, based on what we found underground and sort of if it's a foundation or a feature that kind of gives you that idea, that you're able to say, hey, based on kind of what we know, what's standing right now, this may have been what this looked like, when there was still something above ground. And I think that's really interesting. And I don't know that I don't know that I would think about that often as somebody who's not, kind of in this line of work, because archaeology is, it's under the ground and you're like, well, I don't know what's there, like what did it look like? I don't know.
And yeah, and luckily, here in Delaware, there are distinct patterns that you are able to really trace it. And also Delaware has those orphan court records are the most beautiful things I've ever seen. I mean, some of them are breathtaking in their detail and their color still. And it's just like, oh my gosh, they're gorgeous, but they're really accurate. And so while they're not always 100%, oftentimes things like it was 2 stories, the chimney was on the outside. I mean, some basics they're actually we found to be really wonderful. So you can't always say it looked just like this, but you can always go, okay, this is the flavor, right, of kind of what we're looking for here. And then here's what I have archaeologically. Now let's look around, and then you can kind of look for commonalities. This is what we've been doing and seeing how they come together.
That's awesome. Well, maybe that's
Yeah.
a plug for public archives and maybe the research room at SHPO. There are definitely there are resources out there. There's sort of documents that if you're interested to learn more, you can absolutely make appointments to go and do research and see some of these kind of historical documents that Kerri mentioned, like the Orphans Court records and tax assessment records and things that you I don't know, see how many head of cattle, a farm had,
Mhm.
and just
Well, and that's also where you find the data on, the people who aren't the owners, whether they're a tenant farmer or goodness knows the enslaved individuals. Sometimes you can find names, sometimes you can't, but at least you can tell their presence,
yeah.
and so the archival research is just as important as the stuff or the buildings, is to find out more about the property.
Well, that's awesome. I think I don't see any more questions. So, and I know we're almost at time here. So, I guess, Kerri, do you have anything you want to end with?
No, just thank you all. Appreciate it. Thanks for inviting me.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for taking the time today. This was really, really interesting, and I'm excited that we got to work a little bit more of an archaeology topic into our conference here. And hopefully, if you've got any other work or know of any other work going on, I know we'd love to feature it and learn more. So please keep us
All right.
posted.
Will do. All right. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate
Great,
it.
Kerri. Our next presentation is going to be in about 15 minutes at 3 o'clock. So we'll let our next presenters log on and get situated. We're going to close out this room, but hopefully you can join us at 3. Just use the same link to log on as you did for this presentation. All right, so we'll see you soon. Thank you. Kim and Jennifer, I'm going to close it, and then if you log in again,